Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two incredibly creepy, unsolved disappearances. In the second one, you will think that you know what's going on and that the story is cut and dry, but there is something found at the end which completely changes everything, and it is horrifying. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Mount Shasta, also known as White Mountain, is an active volcano in the Cascade Mountain Range in California. It's 14,179 feet high, making it the second highest in the range and the fifth highest in the state. Snowfall on the mountain and the surrounding area is nearly double the US average, and there's a small chance it could erupt at any time. However, the last time was thought to be around 3,200 years ago. The mountain is also popular with climbers, and the most popular route up is an area known as Avalanche Gulch on the mountain's southwest slope. A good climber can make it up to the summit in a day, but most people like to stop off overnight at either the campsite at the 50-50 Plateau, almost exactly halfway up, or the Helen Lake campsite, which is a little higher, and then summiting the next day. To get to the top as well, you need a summit pass, and before you even start, you have to hike 4 miles up 2 separate trails to a camp where an old Sierra Club cabin marks the start of your climb. Mount Shasta is also the focus of quite a few legends and folklore. Native American tribes of the area believe the mountain to be sacred and the home of the creator of the universe. Other more outlandish stories are about something called the Lemurians. The story goes that in the 1940s, people started to see these 7-foot-tall people in long white robes and sandals go into the local store for supplies, and for money they only used lumps of pure gold. Supposedly, they're a race of beings from a higher dimension who live in the crystal city of Telos inside the mountain, and the saucer-shaped clouds that often appear at the summit are cover for a flying saucer landing above Telos to bring cargo. Carl Herbert Landers didn't believe any of that, but he did have a fascination with the mountain anyway, and he was 69 when he decided he wanted to make the summit. Carl was an experienced climber, about as fit as you can get at his age. He ran every morning and even managed to finish the Boston Marathon in around 5.5 hours. He wanted to climb the highest peak in each of the counties of California, so Mount Shasta was the target. He had actually tried in May of 1998, but weather and altitude sickness turned him back. The following year, he was back again to finally cross it off his list. On May 21st, 1999, Carl and 2 friends, Barry and Milt, stayed in a motel near the trailhead. At 4 a.m., they got their climbing equipment and left for the 4-mile hike to the camp with the cabin. The walk was slowed down by deep snowdrifts that made the going difficult, but a couple of hours later, they got to the camp and began to climb the mountain. Because the snow had slowed them down, they didn't think they could make it to the Lake Helen camp, so they stopped at the 50-50 Plateau overnight instead. This was unfortunately a bit of a rough night. Carl was using a medication called Diamox that was supposed to combat altitude sickness, and either that or something else was giving him diarrhea. This was bad enough that despite a gale blowing, it forced him to leave his tent in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. It also meant that he lost sleep and woke up feeling dehydrated and cold that morning. Because of this, he was worried he'd slow his friends down, so he wanted to leave early to get a head start and set off toward Lake Helen. He put on his rust-brown coat and ski pants, then slipped into his boots and crampons to start the climb. He only had to go around the side of the mountain about 650 feet, which is an easy hike for a man with his fitness experience, and then he'd be at the lake. Carl's friends then watched him disappear around the side of the mountain, and then they started to pack up and follow him. 30 minutes later, they set off in the same direction. They were all traveling light, and the plan was to figure out what the weather was like at the lake, and if it looked good enough for a push to the summit, they'd come back, grab their supplies, and then continue on. Not long after Barry and Milt set off though, Barry started to feel sick, so he turned around and returned to the 50-50 Plateau. Milt continued on and got to the lake in no time, and he expected to find Carl waiting, but there was no sign of him. It was a clear day after all, so he wondered if Carl had just decided to keep going. He asked some guys at the camp there if they'd seen anyone, and they told him that a man had come through and was now on his way up the mountain. So because Milt knew Carl was taking his time because he wasn't feeling too good, he decided to go after Carl and try to catch up with him. But then when he tried, he couldn't. Whoever the guy was, he was climbing pretty quickly. Milt realized that it couldn't be Carl, and when he managed to get a good look, he confirmed it. His clothes were completely different. Milt then returned to the lake and asked around again, but the people there hadn't seen anyone else. But again, Milt figured he probably just missed him as he climbed back down to the 50-50 Plateau, so he just continued on, expecting to join both of his friends at their camp. But then, when he got there, it was 5 p.m. and Carl wasn't in their tent, and his other gear was still there. He knew then that Carl couldn't have tried to get to the summit, so he decided to head back down, thinking Carl might have decided to head back down for some medical attention. But then again, he couldn't find him there or back at the motel, so by then, starting to get worried, he got a hold of the local police to report that Carl had officially gone missing. On the morning of May 26, the sheriff's department brought in a man named Grizz Adams, who is a search and rescue veteran with over 400 searches under his belt. Grizz then brought in everyone he could. They searched on skis, on foot, and on horseback. They brought in helicopters from the Air Ambulance Service and the California Highway Patrol, which is equipped with an infrared sensing device. They also worked in a grid pattern on the ground with volunteers from the neighboring counties and Carl's own running club. Professional climbers even joined the team to explore every part of the mountain they could, descending every possible route. They also brought in tracker dogs, but they couldn't get a scent. Weirdly as well, they also interviewed everyone on the mountain that day, but no one remembered seeing him at the lake or on the path between the 50-50 plateau and the lake. The search eventually got so big they had to move the headquarters from a local schoolyard to the airport. But despite all of this, there was no sign of Carl or any of the equipment he left that day. They couldn't find any trace of him, no prints, no tracks. If it hadn't been for the gear he left behind at 50-50 Plateau, it was as if he'd never been there. Searchers were just at a loss. This was only the second time a man had disappeared without a trace on Mount Shasta. But it was the first time someone had vanished on a flat, easy path on a mountain where as many as 100 people were also climbing, with no crevices to fall into or anything to hide a body. Locals would even describe it as though the mountain had just opened up and swallowed him. It's also worth noting that above the 50-50 plateau, you're above the tree line, meaning it's not like this was a dense forest or anything like that to obscure visibility. It's just bare, rocky slopes. Today, there is still no sign of Carl. People have suggested several ideas to explain this disappearance, but without any evidence, it's still a total mystery. If Milt and Barry are telling the truth, he was last seen that morning before setting off from their campsite. If, for whatever reason, they weren't telling the truth, which seems unlikely, he was at the very least with them when they all checked into the camp to have their permits checked. As with many of these cases, it's just baffling how he could have disappeared so thoroughly in such a short period of time. From when they last saw him, it was less than 30 minutes on a flat, direct path. And in all the years since, you'd think the thousands of people who walked the 50-50 plateau to the lake would have seen something. Maybe a crampon or a boot, but there's just nothing. Leah Toby Roberts was a 23-year-old woman from Durham, North Carolina, and there's no way you could mistake where she was from. She was 5 feet flat, 130 pounds, and always spoke in her thick southern accent, except when speaking Spanish, which she knew fluently. She had sandy hair and blue eyes and liked to keep fit, playing soccer and following a strict vegetarian diet. Her only vice was that she was known to smoke a cigarette or two occasionally and coffee. In 1993, when she was just 17 years old, her father was diagnosed with a chronic and rare lung disease. Then, just 3 years later, her mother tragically died suddenly of a heart attack. At the time, Leah was studying Spanish and anthropology at North Carolina State University, and thankfully the college agreed to let her have some time off. The experience was obviously traumatic, so much so that Leah said she felt like she'd been born again into a new life without a mom. 5 years later, in 1998, she had her own brush with death when a truck pulled out in front of her while she was driving and her car slammed into the side. She survived, but her leg was so badly broken that they had to take her into surgery and insert a metal rod so she could walk. Like when her mother died, Leah talked about being born again by the crash. About a year into her recovery, she planned a trip to Costa Rica to test her Spanish and have a little adventure away from all the stress of regular life. Unfortunately, any excitement she had for the trip stopped when her dad's illness became terminal and he died just before she was due to leave. In the end, Leah decided that her father would have wanted her to go, so that's what she did and enjoyed her time the best she could. After her dad died as well, she inherited some money from him and decided to drop out of college just 6 months before graduating and live on it for a while. She wanted to just spend some time journaling, playing guitar, and doing photography. Her older sister Kara and her brother Heath weren't so crazy about this plan, obviously. The money wouldn't last forever, and she was so close to getting her degree, she might as well just stick it out. But she seemed to be living on her own terms and went out more often to meet new people. Over time, her old friends started to see less of her, but she seemed relatively happy, if private at times. With the inheritance money in the bank and Lee feeling like she didn't have to work, she focused on her writing and spent her days in a coffee shop in her hometown. There, she drank coffee and wrote journal entries and poetry about the meaning of life. And although she may have told people everything was fine, to the people around her who knew her, it did seem like she was struggling with a sense of direction and the loss of her parents. She also used the money to buy music and books, and during this time she became interested in one author in particular, Jack Kerouac. She loved his writing from the 1950s and became slightly obsessed with his book, The Dharma Bums. It's a semi-fictional account of when Kerouac hitchhiked to Desolation Peak in Washington State's Cascade Mountains with a Zen Buddhist. In the book, the pair work as fire lookouts for the US Forest Fire Service, and they spend their time smoking, writing, and meditating there for 63 days, falling in love with the natural beauty. This book was so powerful for her that it inspired her to plan her own visit to Desolation Peak on her own. One of her friends at the coffee shop would even later tell Leah's sister, Kara, that she knew Leah would take off to go to the mountains eventually. It always seemed like Leah wanted to go on the road and be a free spirit, and after all that happened to her in the last few years, Leah had said she needed to go away to figure herself out. On March 9th, 2000, Leah called Kara and the two talked on the phone and joked around and discussed Leah's plans to go to the mountains. Afterward, she talked with her friend Nicole and agreed to babysit with her the following day, which, based on the conversation, made it seem like she had no intention of going anywhere. But that afternoon, just before 6 p.m., Leah abruptly loaded all of her stuff into her Jeep Cherokee, including her cat, withdrew $3,000, and then disappeared. When Leah didn't show up for the babysitting, Nicole wasn't worried. Like many writers, Leah was known to be forgetful, so she figured it just slipped her mind. When there was no sign of Leah for another 2 days, though, people started to worry. Kara started calling everyone who might know where Leah was, but no one had seen her. 4 days later, on March 13th, Kara went to Leah's apartment to look for clues, and she found that Leah had taken most of her belongings, so it looked like wherever she'd gone, she'd chosen to go. But at the same time, because of the phone call she just had with her sister before she left, how upbeat she was and her talk of plans for the future, none of which were to disappear, something felt wrong. This prompted Kara to report her younger sister missing. While Kara was searching as well, she also found a strange note dated March 9th. It was a folded piece of paper, and on the outside, Leah had drawn the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland, smiling and half invisible. Inside was enough cash to cover a month's rent and bills, and there was also a letter. Some of it made sense, like telling them she'd left cookies in the freezer as a going-away present, but a lot of it was odd. Leah told Kara not to worry and that she wasn't a danger to herself. It asked people to have faith in her, themselves, and everyone. It reminded them that everyone is together in thoughts and prayers, and time passes quickly. She also offered her room and laptop, one of the few valuable possessions she left behind, to whoever might want it while she was gone. And finally, it told Kara to remember Jack Kerouac. Kara thought this, and the picture of the Cheshire Cat grin, proved that she decided to follow her idol's footsteps, just as they suspected. In case you aren't aware, the Cheshire Cat suddenly disappeared in Alice in Wonderland, only to reappear sometime later. Why and when the cat does this is still a mystery, and Kara was sure that this was the message. As you might imagine, this was still a bit worrying, but thankfully, Kara had access to Leah's bank accounts. Leah had given Kara access just before the trip to Costa Rica, so Kara could deal with any issues that might crop up while she was away. Kara then went to Leah's bank and got a hold of the information, and she used them to trace Leah's movements as best she could. As far as she could tell, Leah had spent the night of March 9th, so the day she disappeared, in a hotel in Lebanon, Tennessee. Then she bought gas using her debit card while driving west down the I-40. Then she moved on to Oregon, getting there in just 3.5 days after setting off. Then she took the I-5 north, and just after midnight on March 13th, she refueled a gas station in Brooks, Oregon. Unfortunately, that's where the transactions ended. Police would then get a hold of surveillance footage from the gas station, and they found footage of Leah wearing a wide-brim hat and looking well. Before walking outside, she paused to look through the window several times. Unfortunately, the gas station's only cameras were inside, watching the entrance in the tills, so there was no way of knowing what she was looking at. But either way, this was the last time anyone ever saw her. When Kara's 25th birthday came and went without a phone call, she got even more worried. No matter where she was, she knew that Leah would check in on that day if she could. This led her to believe that Leah wasn't just on her way to Desolation Peak, something was wrong. And Kara was proved right when they found Leah's car just a little while later. On March 18th, 2 joggers ran down Canyon Creek Road near Mount Baker in Washington. It's just south of the border with Canada and is a small logging pass that connects to the Mount Baker Highway and lets people in some of the more remote houses and logging camps get back to the main roads. As they ran, they started to notice clothes hanging in the trees along the road. They then followed these and eventually found a wreck at the bottom of a ravine. It was Leah's Jeep, and from where it was found was just 100 miles to Desolation Peak. This is where things start to get confusing. Police suspected that the vehicle must have been traveling way too fast, nearly 40 miles per hour when it left the road. Broken branches and the way the car's contents had been thrown around and out of the car made it look like it had rolled several times before hitting a steep embankment. Weirdly, there was no sign of a body anywhere, and police didn't think that Leah was in the car when it fell. If anyone had been in the car when it crashed, there would have been damage to the seatbelt, a shattered windshield, and traces of blood, but there weren't. There was nothing. However, at the same time, there wasn't any sign to suggest that the car had been ditched on purpose. There were no marks on the car to suggest that it had been pushed, and nothing was holding the steering wheel in place or weighing down the accelerator. Even stranger than that was that it seemed as though the wreck hadn't been abandoned immediately. Pillows and blankets had been used to cover the windows, and it looked like someone had been living there for a short while before leaving. But if that had been Leah, at some point she left without all of her stuff. Most of the cash was still there, as was her checkbook and bank cards. She also left her guitar, CDs, passport, and driver's license. On top of that, after her cat, Leah's most sacred possession was a diamond engagement ring that belonged to her mother. The cat food and carrier were still there, but the cat wasn't, and the ring was hidden under a floor mat. This scared Kara and Heath. They couldn't imagine Leah leaving that ring behind. But other than that, the only clue they found was a movie ticket for American Beauty at a theater in Bellingham, Washington in a little keepsake box. During the investigation, police brought in a search and rescue team, and they used helicopters to look from above and brought in dogs to see if they could find out where she had gone. At that point, the working theory was that she stumbled out into the wilderness after surviving the crash. They then spent the next 2 weeks searching the length of Canyon Creek Road and through the forest close by, but they didn't find any sign of Leah or anything to suggest that anyone else had been there either. They also checked the hospitals nearby, wondering if she might have survived the crash but had amnesia from a bad head injury, but there was no one fitting her description anywhere. During the search, Kara also flew out and went to Bellingham Mall to hand out flyers and put posters up. The movie ticket was for a showing at 2:30 p.m., and Kara guessed that her sister probably would have wanted something to eat beforehand, so someone must have seen her. She then asked around the food court and managed to find out that Leah sat at a bar in the mall's only sit-down restaurant, dining alone but talking with two men on either side of her. When the police tracked one of the men down, he told them he remembered her. He said she was friendly and talked about Jack Kerouac and her travel plans before leaving for the movie on her own. The other man had a different story, however. He agreed that Leah had been upbeat and talkative, but he said she hadn't been alone. She'd gone to the movie with a man named Barry. And the second guy's description of Barry was so detailed that they drew a sketch. It was a white man with a long, thin face, a reasonably square jawline, medium-length hair brushed backwards with no part, and an earring in his right ear. But weirdly again, no one else in the restaurant had seen this other man. Because this description was more detailed than what is typical from an eyewitness, the police started to suspect the second man of having something to do with Leah's disappearance. About a week after Leah's Jeep was found, an anonymous man called police to say that his wife had seen Leah at a Texaco gas station in Everett, Washington. He told them that his wife said she was acting strange, maybe disoriented, and then he hung up in a panic. Everett is 60 miles south of Bellingham, so this fit the timeline. Unfortunately, police never heard back from this witness, and no one has worked out what might have spooked him and caused him to hang up so abruptly. Even worse, this caller was the last lead they had. The case went cold afterward, and there were no more tips or sightings. Understandably, Kara refused to let this go. She got a hold of a woman named Monica Kaysen, who specialized in helping the families of missing persons cold cases. She ran a network of volunteers called the Community United Effect, and they began to run events to keep Leah's memories alive. On the 4th anniversary of her disappearance in 2005, they organized a caravan that drove the route Leah took to Bellingham, and this was the start of an annual event. Monica also got Kara on Larry King Live to keep raising awareness, and the media attention meant that when Kara asked police to keep a hold of Leah's car and possessions, they agreed. This is something they might not have otherwise done. And it was a good job they did, because in 2007, a new detective was assigned to the case after the original lead detective retired. The first thing they did was try another search. This time, they used cadaver dogs and metal detectors to see if they could find Leah's body out near the crash site. They hoped that if Leah had been buried out there, they could use the metal detectors to spot the metal rod in Leah's leg. Again, they didn't find anything, so they turned to the evidence they had. This is when they noticed a few things the old team had missed. One of the things that nobody had thought to check was the Jeep's engine. The new detectives asked forensics to pop open the hood, and when they did, they found that someone had taken off the cover to the starter relay. Without that, you can put the key in the ignition and use the relay to get the car to accelerate even if there isn't a driver inside. This is something that only a mechanic or someone who knew a lot about cars would know how to do. As it turns out, the second man that Leah was at the diner with was an ex-military mechanic. They also found fingerprints on the underside of the hood. With these two findings, they definitely need to speak to the second man again. He moved to Canada, so getting him back for questioning was difficult, but eventually they got to interrogate him and take his DNA and fingerprints. But, unfortunately, again, they didn't match the prints found in the car. However, the new team also got some of Leah's clothing out of storage and sent them to the FBI to be tested for DNA. The previous team had tested for blood, but when Leah disappeared, technology that could pick up trace DNA didn't exist. It took 3 years for them to find anything, but in 2010, they found a man's DNA. The original theories that she either stumbled away from the car suffering from amnesia or staged the whole thing because she wanted to disappear gave way to evidence that something more sinister had happened. Unfortunately, the DNA hasn't matched with anyone yet, including the second man at the diner. The cold case team is still sifting through whatever they can, but over a decade after they took over the case, they still aren't any closer to discovering what happened to Leah. And that's where both of these cases are today, open and unsolved. So, what do you think happened? If you made it this far, thanks so much for tuning in, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.